Perfect. Aaron, do you want to go ahead and kick us off?
Yes, thank you, Adam. I appreciate that. Good morning, everyone, and welcome. My name is Aaron Chan. I'm the Managing Director of Young Professionals in Foreign Policy here in DC. And on behalf of everyone at YPFP, thank you for joining us today. I'd like to extend a special thank you to our partners at the Pan American Strategic Advisors for collaborating with us on this important discussion. A little bit about YPFP. We believe the future of foreign policy depends on creating opportunities for the next generations of leaders to engage directly with today's decision makers and practitioners. Since our founding in 2004, we've connected more than 20,000 members across 80 countries through substantive programming, professional development, publications, and international initiatives. Whether someone's beginning their career or looking to deepen their expertise, our goal is simple: to provide meaningful opportunities to learn, build lasting professional relationships, and contribute to conversations that shape global affairs. Today's event is a perfect example of that mission in action, as I'm happy to say, 200 years after Simón Bolívar convened the Congress of Panama to advance cooperation across the Americas, we have this opportunity to reflect not only on his historical legacy, but also the future of hemispheric cooperation at a time of profound geopolitical change. So there's no better way to explore those questions than with the wonderful experts that Adam and PASA have brought together to discuss diplomacy, scholarship, policymaking throughout the Americas. So if you guys wouldn't mind, I have the privilege to introduce our distinguished panel here. Beginning first with Professor Richard Feinberg. He is a professor of international political economy. He has enjoyed a distinguished career as a diplomat, policy advisor, and corporate consultant, university professor, and author of over 200 books and articles on international relations. He has 4 decades of engagement with White House foreign policy, spanning government service in the White House, State Department, and Department of Treasury, numerous Washington-based public policy institutes, the Peace Corps in Chile, and now academia. Some major accomplishments including the triumph of Allende at age 24, joining the Carter administration to focus on U.S. foreign policy through human rights and democratic freedoms, and serving as a principal architect of the 1994 Miami Summit of the Americas for the Clinton administration. We're also delighted to have Professor Tom Long with us, a professor of international relations at the Department of Politics and International Studies at the University of Warwick, and professor affiliado at the Division de Estudios Internacionales at CIDE, Mexico. Professor Long is the author of 2 books, A Small State's Guide to Influence in the World Politics and Latin America Confronts the United States, Asymmetry and Influence. We are also pleased to have Ambassador Frank O. Mora here with us, Senior Research Scientist at the Jack D. Gordon Institute of Public Policy. He is a professor of public politics and international relations at the Florida International University. Dr. Mora is a former U.S. ambassador to the Organization of American States from 2013 to 2020. Dr. Mora served as director of the Kimberly Green Latin American Caribbean Center at FIU. And prior to arriving at FIU, he served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Western Hemisphere from 2009 to 2013. During the last 20 years, Dr. Mora worked as a consultant to the Library of Congress, the Institute for National Security Studies, the National Democratic Institute, U.S. State Department, OAS, and U.S. Southcom. And Adam, I believe we'll also be joined with Ambassador Ana Delgado. Is that correct?
Yes, I think she just got online for us. Thank you so much,
Okay,
Ambassador.
great. Hi, Ambassador. Thank you so much for joining us. We have Ambassador Delgado here, and she was Panama's ambassador to the Organization of American States. She was the youngest Panama ambassador to the UK and also Panama representative to the IMO, elected vice president of its assembly, and Panama's ambassador to Iceland, Ireland, and Norway. Ambassador Delgado was a member of the Panamanian Parliament from 2019 to 2024, and also, as I understand, a former athlete for the national team, both in fencing and the modern pentathlon. So we're delighted to have these wonderful experts with us. Um, Last but certainly not least, Adam is the founder and CEO of PASA and a member of the Expert Network. He's consulted with the World Bank, Inter-American Development Bank, and U.S. government. I'm incredibly grateful for each of our panelists for taking the time to share with us today, and I'll pass it over to Adam.
Thank you so much, Aaron. I'd like to just first start by echoing my thanks to all of our panelists. I can't think of a better group to be here to dissect kind of where we're at today. We're at a critical moment in regional affairs with multilateralism facing numerous challenges, threats to regional funding and participation. The cancellation of the recent Summit of the Americas, I think, is indicative of this. The emergent non-road doctrine, and challenge, but the collective challenges remain. Whether that's the defense of democracy in the region, transnational crime, or increasingly issues such as climate change. As we mark the 200 years since the Congress of Panama and that foundational moment, I think there's an opportunity for us to reflect. Despite Bolivar's dream, regional integration faces numerous challenges and the proliferation of organizations due to leadership disputes, definitions of what it means to be American, questions about minilateralism, and divergent ideologies. One of the former Secretary Generals of the OAS, Jose Miguel Insulza, said a few years ago that in Latin America, we have had about 100 organizations in the past 100 years, and they have all been dissolved because the governments that created them are no longer there. So there are lots of questions about how long can these efforts continue to exist. On our end at PASA, we'll be releasing a report in the coming weeks that looks at the over 40 regional organizations and how we can possibly try to navigate this. As we look both to the past and the future, a lot of questions emerge about the health and the state of cooperation in the Americas. I'm thrilled to have this distinguished panel together to help us break down where we are and where we're going. For our audience, if you have any questions, please put them into the Q&A section. We will get to as many of them as possible by the end of the event. I also want to flag, especially for Richard, who's representing Mexico here, that we will make sure to end at the top of the hour as promptly as possible so that we can see who will be facing Mexico in the next game at the Azteca. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into the questions. Last week marked the 200th anniversary of the Congress of Panama, and the OAS held its 56th General Assembly in Panama City. To what to you, what are the key legacies of the Congress for politics today? And are there any lessons that we should rethink given today's reality? Given your background, Tom, why don't we go ahead and start with you on this question?
Yeah, thanks so much, Adam and Aaron, for the kind introduction and for organizing this great discussion. I had the opportunity to be in Panama a few weeks ago at an event marking, a more academic event marking the bicentenary of the Congress. And, I think it's interesting that the Congress of Panama has emerged as this sort of symbol, often of Latin American unity, sometimes as kind of the antecedent of Pan-Americanism. But in a sense, a lot of this is a myth. Most of the region didn't attend the Congress of Panama, and those who did concluded the meetings really quickly, in part because they had very reasonable fears of yellow fever. Panama had been ravaged by the independence wars and the interruption of trade across the isthmus, and so there were concerns about there being enough food. And after the Congress, only Gran Colombia ratified the treaties. That said, the Congress left a really important legacy of ideas, if not of institutions. Still, I think rather than kind of the myth building that sometimes happens around this Congress, it's more useful to think of the Congress of Panama as a sort of instructive failure, but one with really important ideational legacies. So if we think of it in that light, and a more nuanced reading of the history, I think. What lessons might we take away? One is that the Congress and its outcomes, the treaties in particular, failed more due to internal rivalries. There was a lot of suspicion around Bolivar and his intentions, than to external pressure from great powers outside of the region. And I think in a moment in which Latin America is facing both external pressure, now from the United States rather than from the Holy Alliance and European powers, this is really important, right? That often, even then, it's important to build internal consensus before facing external pressures. Second, the Congress was not universal, but that's not necessarily a failing. Starting diplomatic initiatives amongst a smaller group and then leaving them open can be perhaps in times where there is division amongst governments a more useful way forward. There are also lessons here for the United States. The United States had a bitter debate about whether it would attend the Panama Congress or not. It eventually decides it would send two envoys. One dies on the way there, the other makes it, but after the Congress has ended. But it's a reminder to us, I think, that one, there have long been disagreements within the United States about how to approach the other countries of the Western Hemisphere. But secondly, that very often the United States has found more value in working through multilateralism than against it. And finally, the Congress of Panama is a great example that Latin America can act, one, as agenda setters, and two, as rule makers. It was Latin American states, Spanish American states, that set the agenda for the Congress of Panama in 1826 and then invited others. And it's for that reason, I think, that the principles that were stated at the Congress of Panama lived on beyond that. Principles like territorial integrity, sovereign equality, broad and participation in multilateral organizations that later become a cornerstone of international order.
Thank you, Tom. Ambassador Delgado, I know you were at the OAS General Assembly. Did you see any of those types of lessons being played out kind of in real time while you were there?
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's really an honor to be in this panel. These familiar faces, my friend Ambassador Frank Mora, whom we worked together at the beginning when I arrived in Washington, D.C., Tom, Long, Richard, and Adam. Thank you so much. So I just actually came back. I landed a few hours ago from Panama. We hosted not only the 56th OIS General Assembly, but we also celebrated the bicentennial of the Amphictyonic Congress with head of states. We had successfully more than 30 foreign ministers in Panama, and it was a high level week. So it was not only the assembly, we just also gather the meeting that Panama presides now, which is the Caribbean Minister of Foreign Affairs meeting. Then we had the head of states meeting on the Monday, celebrating in exactly the day when Libertador Simón Bolívar convoked that Congress on Panama, the 21st of June, 1826. We celebrated the 21st of June, 2026. After that, we had also the Community of Democracies meeting in Panama and also the Global Leaders Summit in Panama, together with many expressions of cultural nature and also sports nature, showcasing cultural diplomacy and sports diplomacy. Having said that, I'd like to share some numbers with you before I enter on some of the more details of your question. We had there more than 396 delegations in Panama from civil society and social actors. We had 39 observer states coming to Panama from their different capitals, from Europe, from Africa, from Asia, and other continents. And of course, we had all member states seated in the table for the plenaries. One of the most important achievement that our government believe we had was that we approved there 4 declarations, 14 resolutions, and we can highlight that we had consensus on the declaration on Bolivia, having the current situation that is going on in Bolivia, and also President Molino decided to organize a mission to go to La Paz, Bolivia, led by the Secretary General and a group of foreign ministers. Second, we have the Declaración de Panamá, the Panama Declaration, which basically strengthens the multilateralism, defend democracy, hemispheric security, and stability in the American states. And also 2 more declarations, one on Haiti and one on Nicaragua. Also, in that assembly, we elected by acclamation 3 members of the Juridical Inter-American Committee, 1 member of the Administrative Tribunal, 1 member of the Audit Committee, and 3 members of the Justice of America Studies Center, CEJA. So that was given the current situation that we all know, we not necessarily have the same, we all have our own differences, but Panama it's keen to play its role of unification, of bringing people to the table and to dialogue. And that, in my opinion, was a shift in this historical assembly. It's the third assembly that Panama hosts. The last one was in 2006, and then one before that in the 90s. And I have to say that the fact and given the importance of this bicentennial and having exactly the Panama General Assembly on those dates give a very important message internationally. You already pointed out that the Summit of the Americas was postponed. We still don't have a date for the Summit of the Americas. The Dominican Republic delegation was present there with the Foreign Minister Roberto Alvarez and Deputy Foreign Minister Cillier. And we, of course, discussed that, but there's still not a specific date for the Summit of the Americas. And I would say that we have many lessons in this assembly, but also, the historical situation in 1826 is different from the current one, but there is something in common. We all want to strengthen the multilateralism organism that have been lately, I would say, changing in many ways. And I think that the fact that we could unite also not only the member states, but also the civil society, private sector, youth, academia, and non-state actors is a very important message. As I said, 200 years after Bolivar invited the Americas to Panama to imagine a common future, Panama once again served as a point of dialogue, consensus building, and hemispheric cooperation.
Thank you for the kind of rundown of exactly all of the pieces that came out of the General Assembly. I think that's really useful. I'm going to kind of pick up on what Tom said is in this next question for Dr. Feinberg and Ambassador Mora. For both of you, how valuable is this myth of kind of the creation of this creation moment, and what is the biggest challenge that we're facing today as we're looking at how to move forward? Ambassador Mora, why don't we start with you?
Sure. Thank you again, Adam and Aaron, for putting this together, and good to be on the panel with friends. I think Tom did an excellent job of running down the history of this and the challenges. There's no question that the durable principle of that Congress is true today, and that the Ambassador Delgado mentioned, which is that regional cooperation among sovereign states is not both possible, I think it's necessary, probably more necessary than ever. But I do want to highlight 2 points that Simón Bolívar dealt with, and the members who participated in that conference dealt with, which unfortunately are still true today, and which are impeding, I think, this dream, this enduring principle. One is internal instability. At the time, the independent countries were plagued by civil wars, fiscal crises, weak institutions, leadership struggles. And that was these internal challenges, this internal fragmentation, internal polarization, undermined, I think, in part, the success of the 1826. Unfortunately, I think that multilateralism today and the effectiveness of the OAS is undermined by these same realities that still exist today, of course, in different ways, but the internal dynamics of these countries, the polarization, the weakness of institutions, the challenge of democracy in the region is having its effect on multilateralism. And in fact, it's undermining the sort of the will, the commitment, and the legitimacy of multilateralism in the region, notwithstanding some of the successes that Ambassador Delgado mentioned. The other thing that I think it's important to mention that was true then and is still true today is this conflicting visions of sovereignty. The conflict between the idea of collective security, collective cooperation, and sovereignty, right? We have noticed, I certainly noticed as I was the U.S. ambassador to the OAS, that the pendulum has shifted quite dramatically towards sovereignty, and that nations, in order to hide these internal challenges, to avoid the shining light of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights and others, to call attention to recession and decline in democracy and democratic institution and human rights, I think are hiding once again, like military dictatorships did in the 1960s and 70s, behind this aura of sovereignty in order to protect and to avoid criticism. And I think the commitment to the Inter-American Democratic Charter that was made some 25 years ago, I think emphasized the importance that there has to be the right balance between sovereignty and collective action, and that sovereignty should not be used as a sort of shield against protecting anti-democratic behavior, violations of human rights in the region. And I think that was true then, although not the issue of democracy so much, but the issue of trying to avoid or undermining, in fact, collective action and cooperation vis-a-vis the issue of sovereignty, or hiding behind the sovereignty issue, which impeded the enduring principle of regional cooperation in the region.
Fantastic points. Dr. Feinberg, would you like to add anything to that?
Yes, well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be on a panel with so many distinguished friends. To add to Frank's last point, when Cesar Gaviria, former president of Colombia, was Secretary General of the OAS, he used to say, "Sovereignty is the shield behind which scoundrels hide their misdeeds." And I think that's exactly what we often see. Just to add a few points, very good points made by my colleagues. To sum up, what I think Panama showed, on the one hand, the importance of vision, the importance of setting forward some ideas that, even when not fully realized, capture the imagination of people's minds and help and remain as an important fixtures that drive forward future actions. But Panama also showed the ambivalence, both in the United States and in Latin America, of working together. The United States was not sure. It delayed so long to send people there because there were sharp divisions in the U.S. Senate at the time. And as Tom Long emphasized, not all Latin Americans were that enthusiastic. And in Bolivar's writings, you can find quotes that suggest Inter-Americanism includes the United States, and then you can find quotes which suggest that Inter-Americanism should not include the United States. In fact, the United States is the problem, not the solution. And so these issues, which were there 200 plus years ago, remain today. I would say that we see cycles in cooperation in the Western Hemisphere. There are periods when there's a convergence of views and values, when the United States and Latin America, most countries, are on the same page. And we saw that in the 1990s, when the United States was able to begin the process of summitry in the Americas in 1994 in Miami, because everybody was on board on the key issues, which was democracy was the only acceptable form of government, and economy should be open to international trade and investment in order to prosper. So we had that convergence of values, and hence multilateralism could work. That convergence has been fragmented. And most importantly, and let's put this right out there, the President of the United States detests multilateralism. He's only comfortable when he's the main man in the room and everybody is circulating around him. So long as that attitude, and it was interesting in Panama, if you look at the declaration, although the U.S. did sign it, it took many, many footnotes. And that suggests the ambivalence of the United States, ambivalence at best, if not hostility towards multilateralism. The other point I would emphasize, Tom very correctly said that multilateralism is an opportunity to set agendas, rules, values, and norms, which countries may still violate, but at their expense. But it's also a place where leaders can get together. And history includes the actions of individuals, not just structural factors. And it matters that leaders should develop chemistry, should know each other, should know something about their families and their spouses. Because then in moments of crisis, in moments of decision making, they then have this personal reference. And when I worked in the White House, I saw this often happen. If President Clinton knew his counterpart personally, had a chance to chat a little bit about their personal histories, whatever, amazing as it may seem, that mattered. And it made it easier for them to reach agreement on specific issues and crises as they would arise. So multilateralism, yes, it sets ideas, it may set some structures in place, but it also creates that interpersonal chemistry, which can be so important in ultimately making vital decisions that affect us all. Thank you.
To kind of pick up on that point about the convergence of ideas and Dr. Long's point about maybe sometimes minilateralism is not such a bad thing or pulling together as a groups of countries. I think it might be interesting to talk a little bit about the Shield of the Americas, right? So this is a multilateral effort, maybe led by one person, but multilateral in nature of having at least a set of countries that was created to promote on a single issue area defense and countering the cartels. We can talk about whether it's the Counter Cartel Coalition or the Shield of the Americas. They seem to be kind of thrown around at the same time. But a lot of its critics, myself included, have pointed out that it was a very ideological bloc, right? It's very much led by kind of right-wing leaders. But this isn't the first ideological bloc that we've seen emerge in the Americas, right? We had UNASUR, which was kind of left-leaning. It was replaced by PROSUR, at least briefly. Are these ideological blocks and kind of minilateralism around a single issue area the way that we start to see multilateralism reform at this moment, where we're seeing this tension? Yeah, go ahead, Dr. Feinberg. I saw your hand go up.
Yes. Well, so Mark Carney, the Prime Minister of Canada, has been using the phrase variable geometry, coalitions of the willing, around issues where not everybody might agree, but you can get a group that launches some agreements. So, for example, at the Los Angeles Summit of the Americas, which was rather contentious, but nevertheless, there were subgroups that agreed on immigration, that agreed on protections of the oceans, that agreed on certain energy issues. So it wasn't all 30 plus countries, but you had a group of 5 or 10 or 20 countries that did say, okay, not everybody has agreed. We don't have full consensus, but we have a large enough group to move ahead. So that sort of purpose-driven coalitions of the willing, I think we will see more and more of that when you cannot get full consensus. But sometimes, as I think Tom mentioned, a group of a critical number of countries can get together. Not everybody signs on at the beginning, but if that shows some success, and if it's an open process, then other countries can gradually adhere to that initial coalition of the willing.
Go ahead, Dr. Long.
Yeah, thanks. A great question. I mean, I would say the Shield of the Americas might have been multilateral in its sort of the picture at the end, maybe, the photo op, but not in its process. And actually the Congress of Panama of 1826 it shows exactly why. There was so much concern at that Congress that no one republic be placed above the others, that there was a decision the host would not be president. Instead, you would have a rotating presidency amongst the countries to show sovereign equality, right? Shield of the Americas is the exact opposite. You have one person standing at the front of the room and everyone else is just there to applaud. And this is what the national security strategy talks about as enlist and expand. This is, I think, in a sense, the opposite of multilateralism in practice. I mean, in one way, I think all regional projects are inevitably ideological in that regionalism is a political project. But when you have, as we've seen quite a bit of, regional projects that are ideological in a partisan sense, they are condemned to be short-lived. They
Right.
cannot outlive the governments that sponsored them, and that's what we've seen a lot of. I think what there is a need for, and this feeds into some of the questions about how young professionals might engage in foreign policy and diplomacy, is thinking about ways that regionalism actually matters on the ground, that it's not just interpresidential, trying to think about building up regionalism amongst local entities sometimes, that is kind of going beyond this sort of the interpresidentialism where a change of party means the end of the regional organization.
Excellent point. Dr. Mora, as somebody who was in the OAS as well, did you see any areas where kind of ideology was a barrier?
Yeah, so just to build on what Tom and Richard said, I couldn't agree more. I think, well, first of all, as we know, regional integration has a at best mixed results or in Latin America, and we've seen the regional organizations rise and come and go and collapse, but the OAS stays, right? And one of the reasons why the OAS has remained is one, it's a charter organization, right? It has a charter, it has clear rules and norms. There's a formality to that organization that has allowed it to survive during good times and at bad times. And at the core of that organization, though it is a political organization, as Tom would argue, it has avoided being focused on ideology. There are governments, of course, and representatives who represent certain ideological perspectives, particularly in the Permanent Council. But if you look at the Secretariat, and it's important to remember that the OAS is not just the Permanent Council, there is the Secretariat piece, where you have staff who are professional, who are non-ideological, who are nonpartisan, who are experts on security, on human rights, on ports, security, I mean, et cetera, et cetera. And they do extraordinary work. And I should add, they don't get the credit for it because of the criticism that often the Permanent Council gets. We don't have another organization in the Western Hemisphere, Adam, that does that. All these other organizations are rather informal. They're not treaty or charter organizations. They don't even often have rules. And that's why they're not sustainable. That's why they don't last very long. And those that are ideologically driven, like the Shield of the Americas, less so, because once there's a change in government in Colombia or Chile or the United States, that those organizations tend to fall apart. And more importantly, in terms of the Shield of the Americas and thinking about who participated, if you're going to have a meeting where the focus is security, and you don't invite Mexico and Colombia and Brazil, that indicates right away that that is a more ideological political organization than one committed to the issues of security. Right there and then you start undermining the legitimacy and the longevity of that particular organization. Over to you.
Ambassador Delgado, do you have anything you'd like to add? I saw your mic came off, so I wanted to see if you wanted to add anything there. No. Um, Let me kind of building on those questions. We've talked about a few of the challenges, sovereignty, ideology. Another one that's been talked about, and Ambassador Mora, you wrote about this, is financing. So I was wondering, you wrote recently in America's Quarterly that the OAS faces a existential threat to its existence because of its financing. Would you like to expand on that a little bit for those who kind of are not familiar with maybe where the OAS finances are?
Yeah, so this is the thing that one of two things that I worked on hard and preoccupied me the most of my time during my time as ambassador. The OAS has always had financial budgetary challenges. That's nothing new. If you look at the history, they've been talking about this since at least the 1970s, if not even before then. So that's nothing new. But if you look at, for example, the OAS in 1984, the OAS had the size of the OAS was a little over 1,000 people who worked at the OAS with a budget of $83 million. This is 1984. Okay. Fast forward to 2024, which is when I was there, the budget just prior to an increase that we led, the budget of the OAS was $84 million, right? With a staff of then 350. So it has been shrinking and shrinking and shrinking, and we're asking it to do more and more and more with less and less and less. There are many problems for that. I'm not going to get into that at the moment. But I think that the key here is that the member states have not made a sufficient enough argument, including the United States, to constituencies in the United States and particularly in Congress, why the OAS is important. why it serves not just US interests, but the interest of the hemisphere, right? And because of that, because it doesn't have a constituency, both in the region and in the United States, it's been very difficult to get the funds necessary to sustain, not to grow, but to sustain the organization. We were able to increase the budget during my time by 10%, but even then, it's a challenge every year. And my understanding is that unless the United States pays what it needs to pay by August, the organization will have to sort of fire hundreds of people of the organization. It could be the end of it. I can't imagine that that's what the United States wants to see at the OAS, but it's a possibility. And so the OAS, more than budgetary challenges, it requires a kind of constituency that it needs to make the argument of why this is important. And with that, it's easier to make the argument of why the organization needs funds.
Fantastic points. I'm thrilled that you're talking about constituencies here because I think it opens the door for some other issues that we should talk about. And Dr. Feinberg, I will get to hear in just one second. But how many people in the United States even know that the OAS exists, I think, is a real challenge in and of itself. For that matter, how many people across the country know all 35 countries that are within the region? I think it's a real challenge and something that needs to be done, not just from the US side, but from governments in the region if they want to see a more productive relationship from the United States, is to get that buy-in and that constituency. Dr. Feinberg.
Yes, well, to add, I think the issues with the OAS, though, it's not just in the United States. The Latin Americans themselves, the tragedy of many Latin American countries is they've seen the OAS as an instrument to try to tie the hands of the United States, rather than to see it as an instrument for collaboration and mutual gain. Now that the US is walking away from multilateralism, suddenly the Latin American countries say, oh my goodness, we love multilateralism. Why is the US behaving this way? And when maybe it's, if their attitude had been different initially, the institutions would be stronger and be in a position to weather the problems of the moment in Washington. But the other point I just wanted to make about financing and multilateralism is multilateralism in the Americas is not just the OAS. It's also the Inter-American Development Bank. And as Frank emphasized, the importance of establishing solid institutions, well-financed, with an actual secretariat and a building. And the Inter-American Development Bank has lent and continues to lend tens of billions of dollars a year throughout the hemisphere to support all sorts of projects. So when we think of multilateralism, actually the strongest multilateral institution in the Americas is the Inter-American Development Bank. The World Bank and the IMF, of course, are also multilateral institutions where the Latin America does participate actively. So those are other examples of large-scale, effective, well-financed institutions that are multilateral, that enjoy the support and the active participation of the Western Hemisphere.
Thank you so much for bringing up the other multilaterals. I think it's really important to highlight the role of the IDB in particular in supporting regional integration. And for the countries that are not members of the IDB to kind of see how we can incorporate them more so as well. As for everyone online, if you have any questions, please start putting them into the Q&A so that we can begin to collect them to ask everyone. I'm going to go ahead and turn towards our last question for the panelists for myself before we go ahead and move on to the Q&A section. I'm going to start with Ambassador Delgado on this one. And because we're co-hosting this with YPFP, what can we do to encourage the next generation to care about Pan-Americanism, inter-American cooperation, the Americas more broadly, both within the United States, but also within the region? And do we need this to be more than just state-to-state diplomacy? And are there ways that we can expand that?
Thank you very much, Adam. So in the future of inter-American systems certainly depends on our next generations. We must ensure that a meaningful place is really shaping it. Actually, in Panama, we had a very important meeting with the young leaders. They met not only during the assembly, but also in multiple parallel events, including young leaders from almost every country of the member states. 21st century diplomacy cannot be limited only to government relations alone. Young people certainly wants to contribute, exchange ideas, and be part of solving the challenges that directly affect their lives, whether it is climate change, digital transformation, artificial intelligence, migration, security, or sustainable development. That means creating meaningful opportunities for engagement through universities, think tanks, civil society, private sector, and organizations such as Young Professionals in Foreign Policy. At the same time, we also need to do a better job of introducing young people to international affairs early on. Through education, model OIS programs, academic exchanges, internships, and mentorship opportunities, we can help them understand that diplomacy is not only distant, but something that shapes in everyday lives and future opportunities. It is not only about preparing the next generation of diplomats, it is about empowering a new generation of leaders who understand the value of dialogue, cooperation, and multilateralism. My country, Panama, has a unique perspective in this. 200 years ago, today, it served as the meeting point where visionary leaders gathered to imagine a shaped future for the Americans. Today, we have the opportunity to build on that legacy by making Panama and the Inter American system as a whole a platform where young leaders across the hemisphere can collaborate, innovate, and help shape the future of our region.
Thank you so much for that. Same question to Dr. Long.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's so much to do, and one thing I would note is that given the sort of the uncertainty that my own students face coming out of university, looking at the job market, of course those uncertainties face those who hope to have careers in diplomacy as well. But things like language skills, cultural and historical understandings translate across a lot of different contexts. They're useful. They're essential in diplomacy, but they're also important in business. They're important in academia. So looking for opportunities to develop those is absolutely essential. And as I sort of hinted to, and I really agree with Ambassador Mora as pointing to the importance of the kind of the on-the-ground work that the OAS Secretariat does. Also thinking about ways that these connections can be built up. The sorts of quasi or paradiplomacy happening amongst cities, amongst border states. And these are really increasingly important ways that governments and different authorities are trying to grapple with the challenges of an interconnected region and an interconnected world. The same with participation in civil society organizations or NGOs. So there are a lot of ways, I think, to kind of engage with this construction of a better hemisphere, in addition to sort of state-to-state diplomacy.
Fantastic. Dr. Mora, over to you.
Yeah, I would say I'll be brief because I really agree with everything. Some people see the current challenges, many of which we've been talking about, as sort of people feel, some amount of despair. And I think that in the current challenges that we face today, there are enormous opportunities to not only sort of be a part of process of reforming, of building, of strengthening, of regaining legitimacy, being early in your career as part of that process, which will create enormous opportunities. I mean, I know we've been a little negative, but don't feel despair or don't say, well, it's not worth fighting for. It is definitely worth fighting for. It is worth pursuing a career, academic or policy in the inter-American system. Yeah, sure. People were excited in the 1990s, as Richard said, when there was this huge convergence of ideas and policies. And boy, I remember it was early in my career how exciting that was. I was very, very young, much younger than Richard Feinberg. And that was easy to be part of that moment, right? It was easy. It was convenient. It's now that we need people. It is now that we need people in the inter-American system. It is now that we need people involved in foreign policy and international relations. because of the challenges and difficulties we're facing. Because of that, I think there are enormous opportunities, and I encourage everyone to pick up and meet the challenge.
Fantastic. And final word to Dr. Feinberg before we go to the Q&A section.
Well, I agree with those points that you can work in international relations these days, in law firms, in the corporate sector, in nonprofits, and there are zillions of opportunities at all levels. I would point out, by the way, that despite the turbulence in inter-American diplomacy, that actually if you look at what's actually happening on the ground in terms of trade flows, for example, within the region and the region globally, remain very robust. We have not entered an era of the end of globalization. Quite the opposite. The private firms, global supply chains, etc., remain very vibrant. And the same is true with regard to finance as well. So yeah, the world remains and will become even more interconnected as we move forward. With regard to young people, as Tom said, of course, you need language skills, but I just would emphasize travel. Get out there, immerse yourself in other cultures, and then when you enter a professional career, you will have those skills and understandings which are critical, whether you're in the public sector, the private sector, or the nonprofit sector.
Fantastic points. Thank you to all of you. Turning to some of the questions from the audience, we have a question from Saul Leon. What is the post-Trump administration, Republican or Democrat, going to do towards Pan-Americanism? Will there be a return to multilateralism, or is unilateralism the approach the United States is going to take moving forward? I'll open that up to any of you who want to take that.
That's very hard to answer. We don't know who. Depends on who the next president is, and it depends on what happens over the next 2.5 years. But I will take advantage of his question to talk about something that I think Richard and I talked about, which is whether the summit process is dead or not, whether a future president, Republican or Democrat, will take on and understand the importance of restoring the summit process. I think there could be an opportunity. I don't believe that the summit process will come back under the current administration, but I do believe, for reasons that Richard explained much earlier, there is great value, and I think people see the important value of the summit, of just meeting and getting together face to face, chatting and talking, even if they don't agree on some major policy issues. So I do believe that we will see that process come back, maybe in a different form or character, but certainly will be back. And because of globalization, because we have no other choice than to work together to deal with these opportunities and these challenges, things or mechanisms like the summit will likely come back in some form or fashion.
Fantastic. Would anybody else like to take a stab at that question from Saul?
Well, so I would add to what Frank just brilliantly said, is that a lot depends not only on attitudes in the United States, but also in Latin America. The Latin Americans have to be interested themselves in engaging constructively with multilateralism. And there, a big problem in the last decade or so has been Chavismo, and particularly the attitudes of Venezuela, now Nicaragua, earlier Bolivia. Now, we'll see where those countries stand in 2 years and 3 years. But one can imagine trends in which Chavismo, which is the anti-Americanism, we don't want to sit down with the United States, except to have rhetorical confrontation. Those attitudes may be fading. And if that's the case, we may possibly have a return to a convergence of values around, hopefully, democracy and open economies, as well as some other issues that have to be dealt with urgently in the 21st century. So I think a lot depends on the attitudes, not only of the United States, but also of governments in the region.
Fantastic points, Dr. Vaughn.
Yeah, just to build on that point from Richard, I mean, I think if we look over the last 15 or so years, there has been nothing approaching consensus amongst Latin America to answer the very basic question of regionalism for what? You know, if we're going to get together, for what is this regional project going to serve? And as long as there's very little, very little agreement on that sort of the foundational purposes of getting together as a region, then it is indeed very hard to create the sort of focalness, the expectation that cooperation happens in one place. It's very hard to generate that. The U.S., when it tries to do it alone, I think is unsuccessful in doing so. In terms of the policies of the next administration, that's of course very, very hard to say. But I think there is a sort of a structural factor that affected both Trump administrations and the Biden administration, and that is the shifting U.S. view of China's role in the region, which is an issue that many Latin American countries see very differently. I think that if the United States continues to insist that there be a choice between the U.S. and China, the answer from much of Latin America is that that's a false choice. That Latin America needs to engage with both the U.S. and China, and if that's presented as a black or white option, it's going to be very hard to sort of to build multilateralism in any form.
Fantastic points. Dr. Feinberg and Dr. Mora, you guys both mentioned this, and it leads perfectly into this next question, which is the importance of the summits just to get people together to chat. Laura Delgado Lopez asks, if individual relationships are important to advance cooperation, are we in a particularly challenging time when the individual leaders proliferating in the region seem to want to be seen as independent, first advancing their own goals versus willingness to concede or align with others?
I'll let Richard start with that.
I think that's implied in your question, in a way, is the answer, yes. And if leaders think that it's in their political interest not to be seen as cooperating with neighbors, then you cannot move forward with successful inter-American cooperation. But the position that leaders take in political campaigns is one thing, but the way they actually govern may be something else. And there, if they see that inter-American cooperation can meet some of their political goals, they may decide, well, actually, some of these fora, including the Summitry of the Americas, might serve their personal interests as well. In other words, there has to be an alignment, a convergence between the interests as defined by the nation states and the goals of inter-American cooperation.
I'm not sure if my colleagues have noticed, but there's a kind of coarseness to the debate that is going on, not just in campaigns, but once presidents, governments in power, the way in which they talk to one another, right? You see the issue between Ecuador and Colombia, for example, and the rhetoric that's used. The former president of CAF, Enrique Garcia, who's been around for a very long time, and so he's seen a lot, said to me once that he's been struck in all his years working in Latin America and working with presidents, how that coarseness, that hostility, the performative aspects of politics that we see today is undermining cooperation. I thought that was, when I first heard it from him, I thought that was too much. I thought that was a bit of an exaggeration. But the more I've thought about it and the more I see the region interact in the way that in which, for example, the Colombian president, I'm sorry, not the Colombian president, the president-elect of Colombia has been quite hostile to the inter-American system and has said that he plans not to send an ambassador to the OAS. Now, whether he does that or not, it's a different story. But then he uses sort of very hostile, confrontational, aggressive language that is not conducive to the things that we're talking about, or even conducive to a future summit of the Americas. So I think that, and that's one reason why I think the summit is so necessary, is to actually bring these people together, have face-to-face conversations, and not engage in the coarse, aggressive, confrontational language, which is mostly performative, but that has long-term consequences for regional cooperation.
Dr. Long, Ambassador Delgado, would either of you like to take a crack at that question?
No, I'm happy to let those excellent responses stand or to let the ambassador come in.
I think I'm fine as well. Thank you, Adam.
Perfect. Well, I would like to thank our panelists for coming on today. We're ending at the top of the hour, so we can see who's going to face Mexico next week, which I think everybody's excited to see. And I think Tom might have a preference, given that he's in the UK right now. So I'd like to thank everybody. I'd like to thank YPFP for co-hosting this event with us today. To our panelists, thank you so much for helping us break down this very complicated time. And to our audience, thank you so much. We'll be sending out the recording to everyone who registered, and putting it up on our YouTube channel as well. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Adam. Thank you,
Thank
everybody.
you. Great to see everyone.